What if the first woman of creation was not Eve? Hidden between the lines of Genesis and erased by millennia of silence, there is a figure history tried to delete. Her name, Lilith. A name surrounded by mystery, fear, fascination, and controversy. One that still shakes religious structures to this day. To some, she was a demon. To others, the first woman created before Eve. And for many, Lilith became a symbol of female independence, freedom, and resistance against structures imposed thousands of years ago. Her story crossed deserts, religions, empires, and generations. She survived in ancient manuscripts, oral traditions, Jewish legends, mystical interpretations, and modern cultural movements. And as time passed, her image only became more powerful. The transformation of Lilith into a demon hides an even darker secret about how society deals with freedom. Today, we are going to uncover how an ancient Sumerian name became the greatest nightmare of religious structures, and what the original texts truly say about her. Because Lilith was never just a character, she became a question, an uncomfortable question. If Lilith truly existed in the ancient accounts of creation, why did her name disappear? To understand this story, we need to travel back thousands of years, long before the internet, long before the great cathedrals, long before the Bible even existed in the form we know today. And while we travel through time, subscribe to the channel, because here we explore the shadows of history that society fears revealing. In the ancient Middle East, civilizations emerged between deserts and rivers. Entire peoples looked to the skies searching for meaning. Gods were associated with wind, fertility, war, and the night. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were already stories about female entities connected to darkness, chaos, and seduction. Some of these figures appeared in Sumerian and Babylonian inscriptions under names similar to Lilitu. And it is precisely there that many scholars believe the myth of Lilith first began to take shape. These entities were described as nocturnal female spirits, beings associated with the desert, the invisible danger of the night, and the fear of the unknown. At that time, night was not merely the absence of light. It represented threat. It was the territory of the supernatural, the place where men disappeared, where diseases emerged, where children died without explanation. Ancient civilizations often created spiritual figures to explain what they could not understand. And little by little, the name Lilith began crossing cultures. But it was within Jewish tradition that her story gained its most famous form. And it all begins with an apparent contradiction. In the book of Genesis, there are two different accounts of humanity's creation. In the first account, man and woman appear to be created together. In the second, Adam appears first, alone, and Eve is created later from his rib. For centuries, attentive readers noticed this difference. In Genesis chapter 1, it is written that God created man and woman simultaneously. But in chapter 2, the narrative changes completely. First comes Adam, then the animals, and only later does Eve appear. For many scholars, this can be explained by the merging of different traditions within the biblical text. But for ancient Jewish traditions, there was another possibility. Perhaps the first woman created alongside Adam was not Eve. Perhaps it was Lilith. This idea would gain strength centuries later in an extremely controversial medieval text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Written probably between the 8th and 10th centuries, the Alphabet of Ben Sira mixes humor, symbolism, folklore, and religious commentary. It was in this manuscript that the most famous version of Lilith's story emerged. According to the text, Lilith was created from the same clay as Adam. She was not born from him. She did not come from his rib. She was made from the same substance, the same earth, the same origin. And precisely because of that, Lilith refused to live in a position of submission. She believed she had been created equal. Not beneath him, not inferior, equal. The conflict between them supposedly began right there. Lilith refused to obey, refused to accept a position of inferiority, refused to exist merely as an extension of another being. According to the narrative, the tension grew until Lilith abandoned the Garden of Eden. She chose to leave. She chose the unknown. She chose freedom, even if it meant becoming a fugitive, an exile, a woman condemned for eternity. After leaving paradise, the myth says Lilith traveled to desert regions near the Red Sea. There, far from Eden, her image began to transform. The independent woman gradually became described as a threat. Later texts associated her with demons, seduction, rebellion, and death. In some medieval Jewish traditions, Lilith came to be seen as a dangerous spirit that attacked newborn children and men during the night. Amulets were used to keep her away. Her name inspired fear. Mothers protected cradles with religious symbols. Prayers were spoken to prevent her approach. But there is something deeply symbolic in this transformation. Because many times throughout human history, women considered too free were turned into threats. Women who spoke too much. Women who questioned structures. Women who refused obedience. Women who chose their own destiny. In different eras, they were called dangerous, immoral, witches, profane. And in Lilith's case, the symbolic punishment was eternal. She stopped being merely a woman. She became a monster. As centuries passed, the myth continued evolving. But how did a figure condemned to the desert for millennia manage to return so powerfully today? The answer lies in the way art began to see her. During the Middle Ages, artists and writers began portraying Lilith as a seductive figure tied to darkness. In some interpretations, she appeared with long black hair. In others, surrounded by serpents, sometimes associated with the very creature said to have tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. Lilith's image began absorbing ancient fears surrounding desire, female independence, and sexuality. She became the reflection of everything patriarchal societies tried to control. And perhaps that is exactly why her story never completely disappeared. Because what is repressed often returns stronger. Centuries later, during modern cultural and intellectual movements, Lilith would rise once again, but this time under a new perspective. In the 19th century, Romantic artists began seeing her not merely as a demonic creature, but as a powerful woman. Paintings portrayed Lilith as hypnotic, mysterious, free, almost divine. In literature, she became a symbol of independence and rebellion against imposed standards. And in the 20th century, especially with the rise of feminist movements, Lilith was reinterpreted once again. For many women, she no longer represented danger. She came to represent resistance. Her refusal to obey was no longer seen as sin. It was seen as courage. Lilith began appearing in books, songs, paintings, films, and academic studies. Her name was reclaimed as a symbol of female autonomy. She became a metaphor for women who refuse to live in silence, women who choose to define their own identity. In some contemporary movements, the symbol of Lilith began being used as an amulet, a representation of emotional, intellectual, and spiritual independence, not as worship, but as affirmation, as a reminder that questioning ancient structures can be a deeply transformative act. At the same time, Lilith's figure continues dividing opinions. For more conservative religious groups, she remains associated with demonic interpretations. For scholars, she represents a fascinating blend of mythology, oral tradition, and cultural construction. For artists, Lilith remains an endless source of inspiration. And, for millions of people around the world, her story awakens an unavoidable reflection. How many narratives have been erased throughout history? How many voices disappeared between translations, rewritings, and interpretations created by societies dominated almost exclusively by men? Lilith's story is not only about religion, it is about power, about who writes the narratives, about who decides which characters deserve to be remembered and which deserve to be forgotten. Perhaps that is exactly what makes Lilith so fascinating even today. Lilith lives on the border between an ancient legend and a cry for freedom, between fear and admiration, between condemnation and liberation. She represents the discomfort caused by women who refuse imposed limits. And regardless of whether one believes in her existence within ancient traditions, one thing is impossible to deny. Lilith survived. Her name crossed millennia. She survived destroyed manuscripts, religious persecution, contradictory interpretations, centuries of silence. Few mythological figures have remained so present in the human imagination for so long, because Lilith touches something deep, something universal. The fear of freedom, the fear of change, the fear of those who challenge what has always been considered normal. And perhaps the most intriguing part is realizing that her story is still being rewritten today. Each generation sees Lilith differently. Demon, goddess, rebel, victim, symbol, legend. But in all these versions, there is one thing in common. Lilith never accepts remaining silent. Perhaps that is why she keeps returning. In books, in art, in music, in debates about identity, in discussions about religion, in social movements. Lilith became far greater than an ancient character. She became a mirror, a reflection of humanity's tensions surrounding freedom, equality, and power. And in the end, perhaps the biggest question is not whether Lilith truly existed. Perhaps the real question is another one. Why does her story still disturb so many people thousands of years later? Because some narratives never truly disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to return. And when they do, they reveal what the world tried to hide. Lilith remains one of those stories, an ancient shadow walking beside humanity, silent, mysterious, and impossible to forget.